The fastest way to discover who really owns a road is to watch what happens when somebody tries to take it away. The first thing I heard that morning was the angry roar of engines echoing through the pine-covered hills outside my estate. I stepped onto the stone terrace overlooking the valley and saw a line of SUVs stretching nearly a quarter-mile down the mountain road. Headlights cut through the early morning mist. Brake lights glowed red between towering pines. Drivers were climbing out of their vehicles, pointing toward the massive black iron gate that now stood closed across the entrance to my property. The smell of wet earth and pine sap hung in the cool air. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried from the ridgeline. Normally, the mountain was quiet at sunrise. Not that day. Standing at the front of the crowd was Patricia Monroe. Even from several hundred feet away, I could recognize her. White jacket, expensive sunglasses, phone pressed tightly against her ear. One hand waving dramatically toward my gate as if she were directing traffic at an emergency scene. Around her stood dozens of frustrated homeowners from the HOA. Some looked confused. Others looked irritated. Most had no idea why the road was closed. Patricia certainly thought she knew. The problem was that she was wrong. Very wrong. The gate itself was impossible to miss. 12 feet tall. Matte black steel. Freshly installed signs mounted on both sides. Private estate road. Authorized access only. The signs reflected the pale morning sunlight as mountain fog drifted through the trees. Patricia pointed directly at them while speaking into her phone. Even from that distance, I could hear her voice carrying across the valley. She wanted law enforcement. She wanted county officials. She wanted somebody to force me to open the road immediately. What she did not realize was that her phone call was about to become the biggest mistake of her entire HOA career. I took a sip of coffee and watched the scene unfold. The mug felt warm against my hands in the cool mountain air. My family had owned this land for generations, long before luxury homes appeared on the neighboring ridges, long before the HOA existed, long before Patricia Monroe decided she should control everything she could see from her boardroom window. The road winding through the mountain below me was not some public access route. It was not HOA property. It was not county property. Every curve, every retaining wall, every drainage ditch, every foot of gravel and pavement sat on land my family paid for, maintained, and legally owned. Yet somehow, over the years, Patricia had convinced herself that ownership and convenience were the same thing. Behind her, homeowners gathered around in growing numbers. More vehicles arrived every minute. Doors slammed. Voices echoed through the trees. Then Patricia lowered her phone and smiled. The kind of smile people wear when they think help is on the way. I glanced once more at the closed gate, the waiting crowd, and the winding mountain road disappearing into the forest beyond. Then I looked toward the county highway far below, where distant emergency lights had just appeared between the pines. The emergency lights slowly climbed the mountain road while the crowd gathered below my gate continued to grow. From my terrace, I could see people stepping out of luxury SUVs wrapped in jackets against the cool morning air. Some carried coffee cups. Some held phones. Most looked annoyed that their normal routine had been interrupted. None of them knew the full story. The smell of pine needles and damp soil drifted across the hillside as the sun climbed above the eastern ridge. Golden light filtered through the trees and illuminated the winding road that cut through my estate like a ribbon. That road was the reason all of this was happening. My name is Jack Sullivan, and my family had owned this mountain property long before anybody imagined building an upscale community beyond the western ridge. My grandfather purchased the original acreage after returning from military service decades ago. Back then, there was nothing here except forest, rock, and wildlife. No gated entrances. No homeowners association. No million-dollar houses tucked between the pines. Just land. Lots of it. My father spent years developing the property. He supervised crews that cleared trees, graded slopes, installed drainage systems, and eventually built the road winding through the mountainside. It was not cheap. It was not easy. Mountain construction never is. Every retaining wall had to be engineered. Every culvert had to be approved. Every section of pavement required careful planning because winter storms could destroy months of work overnight. By the time the road was finished, it represented years of investment and sacrifice. More importantly, it belonged to our family. As the years passed, developers purchased neighboring parcels beyond our land. Luxury homes appeared, then more homes, then an entire planned community. The developers needed access to reach their new neighborhood, and the simplest solution was to connect through the existing road crossing our estate. Agreements were drafted. Lawyers became involved. Easements were created. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. For many years, the arrangement worked exactly as intended. Residents traveled through peacefully. My family maintained the road. Nobody complained. Then Patricia Monroe became HOA president. At first, I barely noticed. Most HOA politics never reached my side of the mountain. But gradually, small things began changing. New signs appeared. HOA logos started showing up near intersections. Rules were posted along sections of road that did not belong to the association. Security cameras appeared without permission. Maintenance contractors hired by the HOA started acting as if they managed property beyond their authority. Every year, the assumptions grew larger. Every year, the boundaries became blurrier. Standing on the terrace that morning, I watched the flashing lights move closer through the trees and realized how far things had gone. Down below, Patricia stood at the front of the crowd, speaking confidently to anyone willing to listen. She pointed repeatedly toward my gate, as if she were explaining an injustice. Around her, homeowners nodded and exchanged frustrated comments. They believed they had been denied access to something they were entitled to use. The truth was more complicated than that. And before the day was over, everyone on that mountain was going to learn exactly where that road began, exactly who owned it, and exactly why closing that gate had become necessary. Patricia Monroe did not become the most feared person in the community overnight. Like most people who accumulate too much influence, she started small. A landscaping rule here. A parking policy there. Harmless changes that sounded reasonable during monthly meetings. Most residents never paid much attention. They were busy with careers, families, vacations, and mortgage payments. Patricia understood something important about community politics. The fewer people pay attention, the easier it becomes to expand authority. Standing on my terrace that morning, I watched her move through the crowd below with the same confidence that had defined her leadership for years. Homeowners gathered around her as if she already knew how the situation would end. In her mind, she probably did. Patricia had spent nearly 6 years transforming the HOA from a neighborhood association into something much larger. She chaired every important committee. She influenced vendor contracts. She controlled meeting agendas. She always seemed to know what information reached residents and what information stayed buried inside board discussions. If someone questioned her decisions, they often found themselves tangled in endless procedural debates. Most eventually gave up. The mountain community itself was beautiful. Large homes sat along ridgelines overlooking valleys filled with pine forests and granite outcroppings. During autumn, the hills exploded with color. During winter, morning frost covered rooftops like silver dust. People paid a premium to live there because of the views, the privacy, and the peaceful atmosphere. Ironically, the one thing nobody ever talked about was the road connecting them to the outside world. Most residents treated it like a natural feature of the landscape, as permanent and unquestionable as the mountains themselves. Patricia treated it differently. She saw it as leverage. Over time, HOA signs began appearing alongside sections of roadway. Security notices were posted. Directional markers displayed HOA logos. Maintenance announcements referred to the route as a community-managed access corridor. The language changed first. Then the assumptions followed. New residents moving into the neighborhood naturally assumed the association controlled the road because every visible sign suggested that was true. Few people ever checked property records. Few people asked questions. Why would they? The road existed. It functioned. Their vehicles traveled over it every day without issue. Meanwhile, Patricia grew more comfortable speaking about infrastructure she did not actually own. I remember one community event 2 years earlier when she stood beside a large map and referred to the roadway as a strategic HOA asset. The phrase stuck with me because it sounded wrong. Not legally wrong in a dramatic way, just wrong enough to make me uneasy. That feeling grew stronger each year. Down below, another county vehicle arrived at the gate. The crowd shifted to make room. Patricia immediately moved toward the newcomers, already preparing to explain her version of events. The morning sun had fully cleared the ridge now, casting long shadows across the pavement winding through my property. Looking down at that road, I realized something that Patricia never seemed to understand. You can convince people that you control something. You can print signs. You can hold meetings. You can repeat the same claim for years. But ownership does not change because someone repeats a story often enough. And hidden inside decades-old legal documents was a detail Patricia had ignored for far too long. A detail that was about to turn her entire plan upside down. The county vehicles finally reached the gate and came to a stop beside the growing line of waiting SUVs. Gravel crunched beneath tires. Doors opened. Uniformed personnel stepped out and immediately found themselves surrounded by homeowners eager to explain why they believed the road should be opened. From my terrace, the entire scene looked almost surreal. Morning sunlight poured through the pine trees, illuminating the winding pavement that disappeared through my property before continuing toward the neighborhood beyond the ridge. The road looked peaceful. It always did. Yet that morning it had become the center of a dispute that had been building for years. Patricia moved quickly toward the county representatives. Even from a distance, her confidence was obvious. She gestured toward the closed gate, then toward the waiting residents behind her. Every movement suggested certainty. She wanted the situation resolved immediately. She wanted the gate opened. Most of all, she wanted validation. What she did not realize was that the problem was no longer about inconvenience. It was about documentation. As conversations unfolded below, my attention drifted to the signs that had appeared along the roadway over the past few years. Several of them were visible from where I stood. HOA speed notices, HOA traffic advisories, HOA maintenance markers. One sign even displayed a community logo beside language implying operational oversight of the route. None of those signs had existed when my father maintained the property. None of them appeared in the original agreements. They had simply arrived over time, one piece at a time, until most residents stopped questioning them. The smell of sun-warmed pine bark filled the air as a breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a woodpecker hammered against a trunk. The mountain itself seemed completely indifferent to the arguments happening below. That contrast always struck me. Nature rarely cares about human assumptions. Ownership records do not care either. One of the county officials began walking slowly along the entrance area, examining signs and making notes. Another spoke with residents. Patricia remained close, clearly trying to direct the conversation. Meanwhile, homeowners started gathering in smaller groups. Some appeared frustrated. Others looked confused. A few seemed genuinely curious. That curiosity mattered because questions have a way of spreading once they begin. Several residents pointed toward the road. Others pointed toward the gate. One man pulled out his phone and began searching property maps. Another homeowner appeared to be reviewing old HOA communications. The atmosphere was changing. What had started as collective outrage was gradually turning into uncertainty. I took another sip of coffee and looked toward the file resting on a table behind me. Inside were copies of surveys, easement agreements, maintenance records, and correspondence spanning decades. I had not closed the gate on impulse. I had not done it to make a statement. I had done it because months earlier I discovered something buried deep inside the original access documents. A clause so specific that almost nobody remembered it existed. For years, the HOA had operated as though that language did not matter. For years, Patricia acted as though the road belonged to whoever used it most. But legal agreements are patient. They wait quietly until someone finally reads them. And before the morning was over, that forgotten clause was going to become the most important piece of paper on the entire mountain. The file on the table behind me had become something of an obsession over the previous 6 months. Not because it contained anything dramatic at first glance. In fact, most people would have fallen asleep trying to read it. Hundreds of pages of surveys, engineering reports, easement agreements, maintenance logs, property maps, amendments, and correspondence dating back decades. The kind of paperwork that gets boxed up and forgotten once construction is complete. Yet buried inside those records was the reason I had closed the gate. A gust of wind moved through the pines as I stepped inside my study and opened the file once again. Down below, county officials continued speaking with residents while Patricia worked hard to keep control of the narrative. She still believed this was a simple access dispute. She still believed someone would order the gate opened and restore the status quo. What she did not know was that the status quo had already been broken years earlier. The original easement granted limited access across the estate road to reach the neighborhood beyond the ridge. The language was clear. Residents could travel through. Emergency vehicles could travel through. Utility providers could travel through. In exchange, specific conditions had to be maintained. Certain areas could not be modified. Signage could not misrepresent ownership. No third party could assume management authority over the roadway. Most importantly, the easement could not be expanded beyond its original purpose without written approval from the property owner. For decades, none of that caused problems. Then little things started happening. The first issue seemed harmless. An HOA maintenance contractor installed signs identifying the road as part of a community-managed system. I documented it and requested removal. The signs stayed. Then cameras appeared along sections of the route. Then HOA newsletters began referring to the roadway as a community asset. Then came contractor crews performing work without notification. Every incident by itself appeared minor. Together, they painted a very different picture. I spent months collecting photographs, correspondence, invoices, newsletters, and public statements. The deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA was no longer acting like a group benefiting from an easement. It was acting like an owner. That distinction mattered very much. The smell of coffee filled the study as I reviewed one particular page again. It contained language from an amendment drafted years before Patricia became president. Most people probably skipped over it entirely. One paragraph, 3 sentences, less than 100 words. Yet those words changed everything. The provision stated that material violations affecting ownership representation or unauthorized management activity could trigger immediate suspension pending legal review and compliance verification. Simple language, powerful consequences. When my attorney found it, he actually called me back twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. We reviewed the records again. Then a third time. The conclusion never changed. Years of HOA behavior had crossed a line hidden inside documents almost nobody remembered existed. Down below, I could see county personnel beginning to request records from multiple parties. Homeowners were asking more questions. Patricia looked increasingly frustrated. The mountain road stretched through the forest beneath the morning sun, quiet and motionless behind the closed gate. For years, people treated that road as something permanent and unquestionable. They never imagined that a forgotten clause written decades earlier could suddenly become the most important document in the county. But sometimes the smallest paragraph changes the entire story. The truth was that I could have acted much sooner. I could have challenged the signs the moment they appeared. I could have hired attorneys after the first misleading newsletter. I could have demanded hearings, filed complaints, and spent years fighting every small violation one at a time. Instead, I waited. Patience often looks like inaction to people who do not understand strategy. From the beginning, my attorney gave me simple advice. Document everything. Let the facts accumulate. Let the pattern become impossible to ignore. So that is exactly what I did. The mountain road became my silent witness. Every unauthorized sign was photographed. Every maintenance crew that appeared without permission was documented. Every HOA communication referring to the roadway as community-controlled property was archived. Cameras positioned around the estate entrance quietly recorded activity month after month. The evidence grew steadily, like rings inside a tree trunk. Down below, county officials continued reviewing information while residents clustered into increasingly animated conversations. The morning sun was higher now, warming the pavement and filling the valley with the scent of pine and dry earth. From my terrace, I could see Patricia moving from group to group, trying to reassure homeowners. She still carried herself with confidence, but it was different now. Less certainty, more urgency. The questions were beginning to spread faster than the answers. Several homeowners had already started comparing old HOA newsletters with county property maps they found online. Others were reviewing community budgets. Once people begin checking documents for themselves, narratives become much harder to control. I walked back into the study and opened another binder. Inside were copies of letters my attorney had sent over the years. Professional, respectful, direct. Requests to remove misleading signs. Requests to stop representing the roadway as HOA-managed infrastructure. Requests to clarify ownership language in official communications. Most received polite responses. Very few produced meaningful changes. In hindsight, that refusal to correct course became one of the most important pieces of evidence. It demonstrated something larger than a misunderstanding. It demonstrated a pattern, a deliberate pattern. The breeze carried the sound of distant voices through the open window as I reviewed a series of photographs taken over the previous 18 months. HOA-branded traffic markers, HOA maintenance notices, contractor equipment operating beyond approved areas. None of it seemed dramatic individually. Together, however, the images told a story that no amount of explanation could erase. My attorney called it cumulative conduct. I called it digging a hole. Either way, the result was the same. The original easement depended on compliance. Compliance depended on respecting boundaries. Boundaries had not been respected for a very long time. The closed gate below was not a surprise reaction. It was the final step in a process that had been unfolding for years. Every photograph, every letter, every archived newsletter led to that moment. Patricia thought she was responding to a sudden decision. In reality, she was responding to the consequences of hundreds of decisions made long before that morning. A county vehicle slowly rolled farther down the entrance area while officials continued speaking with residents. More documents were being requested now. More records were being reviewed. The investigation had moved beyond a simple access complaint. And standing there above the valley, watching sunlight spread across the mountain road winding through my property, I realized that the trap was no longer mine to trigger. The evidence was doing that work on its own. By late morning, the mountain no longer felt like a quiet residential community. It felt like a place where two completely different versions of reality had collided. The line of vehicles remained backed up near the entrance, but the mood had changed dramatically. Earlier, people were angry because they believed access had been unfairly blocked. Now they were asking questions. Lots of questions. The difference mattered. Anger looks for someone to blame. Questions look for evidence. And evidence rarely favors assumptions. I left the study and walked outside toward a ridge overlooking the entrance road. The air had warmed considerably. Sunlight reflected off windshields below while pine branches swayed gently in the breeze. From that vantage point, I could see county personnel speaking with homeowners in small groups. Some residents held printed HOA newsletters. Others compared documents on tablets and phones. Every few minutes, someone pointed toward one of the HOA signs positioned along the roadway. Those signs had become impossible to ignore now that ownership was being discussed openly. Patricia continued moving through the crowd, trying to project confidence, but the dynamic had shifted beyond her control. The more information surfaced, the more residents began noticing things they had overlooked for years. One homeowner questioned why HOA funds had been used to install infrastructure markers on property the association did not own. Another wanted to know why maintenance notices repeatedly described the road as community managed. A retired engineer reportedly brought up old development maps that contradicted several assumptions many residents had accepted without question. The questions kept spreading. The mountain breeze carried fragments of conversation uphill toward my position. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough. Confusion was replacing certainty. The road itself remained silent beneath it all. A long ribbon of pavement cutting through forests, crossing drainage channels, and winding between granite slopes before reaching the neighborhood beyond the ridge. Looking at it, I thought about how strange the situation really was. For years, the HOA treated the road as though usage created ownership. Yet every legal document said otherwise. The road had never changed. Only the story surrounding it had changed. Around noon, my attorney called. His voice sounded calm, almost amused. County officials had requested copies of several records directly from his office. Easement files, historical surveys, compliance correspondence. Everything we had spent months organizing was finally being reviewed by people with authority to interpret it. That was the moment I realized the situation had passed a point of no return. The gate was no longer the central issue. The road was no longer the central issue. The central issue had become whether years of assumptions could survive direct examination. Down below, Patricia stood near one of the largest HOA signs along the route. She was speaking passionately to a group of residents, but fewer people seemed willing to simply accept what they were hearing. They wanted documents now. They wanted records. They wanted proof. And standing there beneath a cloudless mountain sky, surrounded by pine forests and decades of history, I knew something Patricia still had not fully understood. The gate had not trapped the HOA. The evidence had. Shortly after noon, the answer everyone had been waiting for finally began to emerge. The crowd near the entrance had grown quieter, not because people were satisfied, but because they were listening. County officials had spent hours reviewing records from multiple sources. Property surveys were compared against easement agreements. Historical development plans were reviewed. Maintenance responsibilities were examined. Every document seemed to point in the same direction. The mountain air felt warmer now, carrying the scent of sunlit pine and dry grass across the ridgeline. Below me, the line of vehicles remained where it had been all morning, but nobody was talking about inconvenience anymore. The conversation had shifted entirely toward ownership, authority, and compliance. Patricia stood beside one of the county representatives while several residents gathered nearby. Her posture remained determined, but the confidence she displayed at sunrise was fading. She could no longer rely on assumptions because assumptions were being replaced by records. One homeowner held a copy of an easement map. Another was reviewing correspondence from years earlier. A retired attorney who lived in the community had apparently begun reading through portions of the agreement himself. Every new set of eyes seemed to uncover another detail. Then the discussion moved toward the provision my attorney had identified months earlier. The forgotten clause, the same language that had quietly existed inside the easement for decades. County officials examined it carefully. Questions were asked. Additional records were requested. Compliance history was reviewed. The result was not dramatic in the way movies portray legal disputes. There were no speeches, no sudden declarations, just professionals comparing facts to documented obligations. Yet the impact was enormous. The review confirmed that multiple actions taken over the years appeared inconsistent with the limitations described in the agreement. Signage implying ownership, representations of management authority, activities extending beyond the original purpose of the access arrangement. Individually, each issue might have been dismissed. Together, they painted a very different picture. The breeze moved through the trees as homeowners listened to explanations from county staff. Several residents looked genuinely stunned. Others seemed frustrated that they had never been informed about the actual structure of the agreement. One homeowner asked whether the association had ever possessed ownership rights over the roadway. The answer was simple: no. Another asked whether community use automatically created authority. Again, no. The road remained what it had always been: private property subject to a specific legal arrangement. Nothing more, nothing less. Patricia attempted to argue that the community depended on the road and therefore needed uninterrupted access. Nobody disagreed with the importance of access. The problem was that importance and ownership are not the same thing. By mid-afternoon, county officials reached a preliminary conclusion that immediately changed the situation. Pending further review and corrective measures, the existing access arrangement could not simply continue as though nothing had happened. Compliance issues had to be addressed. Documentation had to be verified. Conditions had to be examined. The irony was impossible to ignore. Patricia had called for outside intervention, believing it would force the gate open. Instead, the official review triggered by that call had focused attention on years of unresolved problems. Standing on the ridge above the valley, watching sunlight spill across the winding road cutting through my family's land, I realized the moment had finally arrived. The road had not been shut down by anger. It had not been shut down by personal conflict. It had been shut down by the very process Patricia asked to begin. Several weeks later, the mountain looked exactly the same, but the community felt completely different. Autumn had begun creeping across the ridgelines, painting sections of the forest in shades of gold and amber. Cool morning air drifted through the pines as I walked along the estate road shortly after sunrise. The gate remained in place, solid and quiet beneath the towering trees. For the first time in years, there was no confusion about what it represented. No misleading signs. No unofficial authority. No competing claims. Just a clearly defined property boundary supported by documents that had existed all along. The county review continued for some time after that day. Additional records were examined. Historical agreements were clarified. Compliance requirements were established. Eventually, a new access arrangement was negotiated that accurately reflected ownership, responsibilities, and legal limitations. Residents finally received clear information instead of assumptions. The process was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was simply thorough. And that thoroughness changed everything. Several of the old HOA signs disappeared from the roadway. Community communications were revised. Language that had been repeated for years quietly vanished from newsletters and announcements. Homeowners who had spent most of the dispute asking questions finally received answers. Many were surprised by how different the reality was from what they had always been told. Some were frustrated. Others were relieved. Most simply wanted stability. As for Patricia Monroe, her influence never fully recovered from the events triggered that morning. People began examining decisions more carefully. Meetings attracted larger attendance. Financial reports received greater scrutiny. Residents who rarely participated in community affairs started paying attention. Accountability has a way of spreading once people realize its value. One afternoon, while driving through the neighborhood, I noticed something that made me smile. A group of homeowners stood beside a community bulletin board reviewing proposed policy changes. They were discussing documents, asking questions, and comparing information. Months earlier, most would have accepted whatever appeared on the page. Now they wanted evidence. That cultural shift mattered far more than any personal victory. The road stretched ahead of me through the mountains, winding between granite outcroppings and tall pines exactly as it had for decades. My grandfather would have recognized every curve. My father would have recognized every retaining wall. The landscape remained unchanged. Only the story surrounding it had changed. Near sunset one evening, I parked beside an overlook above the valley and stepped out into the cool mountain air. The western sky glowed orange behind distant ridges. Long shadows stretched across the forest. Below me, the road cut through the landscape in a quiet line before disappearing into the trees. Looking at it, I thought back to the morning when dozens of vehicles gathered at the gate and one phone call set everything in motion. Patricia believed outside intervention would force compliance. Instead, it forced transparency. She wanted authority to settle the dispute. Authority settled it by examining the facts. In the end, the road was never the real issue. The issue was whether assumptions could survive contact with reality. The answer turned out to be simple. They could not. As the last sunlight faded beyond the mountains, a cool breeze moved through the pines, and the road grew quiet once again. It had carried generations of travelers across this land. It would carry many more in the years ahead. The difference now was that everyone finally understood exactly whose road it was and why the truth had been there all along, waiting patiently for someone to read it.